My wife passed away not long ago. Before I could heal, my son took me to court. He wanted everything I had left. When the judge delivered the verdict, all I received was the cabin my wife left behind, one duffel bag, and $14,500. I fled there heartbroken and lost. After 14 days while cleaning, I took down her favorite painting and found the sealed envelope hidden behind it. When I saw the truth she'd kept secret, I broke down sobbing. She had protected me until her last breath in ways I had never imagined. Welcome to today's story. If this resonates with you, hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. A quick reminder, this narrative includes fictional elements added for storytelling and emotional depth. Any resemblance to real names or places is coincidental, but the lessons about trust, family, and forgiveness are what matter most. The road stopped being a road about 2 miles back. After that, it was gravel, then packed dirt, then something that might generously be called a path, 2 shallow ruts worn into the hillside by decades of the same tires making the same turns. Ray's old pickup complained the whole way up the headlights, cutting through the dark in 2 pale yellow cones that didn't reach far enough to be much comfort. I sat in the truck after I cut the engine, just sat there. Below the hillside, through the gaps in the tree line, I could see the faint silver of Harlow Lake catching what little moonlight was left. The water didn't move much. The trees didn't either. Everything up here had a way of going still at night, like the whole county had agreed to hold its breath until morning. I was 61 years old. I had 1 duffel bag in the back seat and a flashlight I'd bought at a gas station 40 miles south. That was the full accounting of what I had left. I got out of the truck. The cabin sat at the top of the rise, the way old stone houses do. Not dramatic, not picturesque, just there. Solid and gray and patient, the way things built to last tend to look after enough decades. Eleanor had loved that about it. She used to say the house looked like it had opinions. Standing in front of it now in the dark, I understood what she meant. The padlock on the front door was rusted completely shut. I tried the key twice, turning it both directions, like trying it a second time might produce different results. It didn't. The lock had probably been frozen like this for the better part of 2 years, sitting through 2 full winters and 2 wet springs, with nobody to open it and nobody to care. I walked around to the woodpile on the side of the house and found a rock about the size of my fist wedged against the bottom log. It took 7 strikes before the shackle finally gave way and dropped into the weeds below the step. I stood there counting them after just because my brain needed something small to hold on to. The door swung inward and the smell came out to meet me. Damp wood was the first thing, the deep settled smell of a house that had been closed up through seasons. The kind that lives in the walls and the floorboards and doesn't go anywhere, no matter how many windows you open. But underneath it, fainter, almost gone, but not quite lavender. Eleanor had kept small sachets of dried lavender in every room. She grew it herself in the side garden and dried it in bunches over the kitchen window each summer. I hadn't thought about that in years. I stepped inside. The flashlight beam moved around the room. Too much shadow, not enough light, every corner looking deeper than it probably was. But as my eyes adjusted, I could make out the shapes of things. The bookshelf against the far wall still full. The armchair with the worn left armrest where Eleanor always rested her elbow when she read. The kitchen table with 4 chairs, one of them pushed out at an angle, as if someone had just stood up from it. And the paintings, 11 of them hung across every wall of the main room and up the stairwell. Eleanor had painted every one herself, landscapes mostly. The lake, the tree lines, the hillside in different seasons. I'd lived with them for so many years that I'd stopped actually seeing them. Standing in this room after 2 years away, I saw them again. I found the fuse box in the back hallway behind the door that always stuck in humid weather. I put my shoulder into it, and it opened with the groan of a house that had been waiting for something without knowing what. The breakers were all tripped to the middle position, the classic sign of a house properly shut down by someone who knew what they were doing. Eleanor had always known what she was doing. I flipped them one by one. The kitchen light came on, not fully at first, just the flicker of an old bulb, deciding whether it still had the will to work, settling finally into a pale, steady yellow that fell across the table, and the 4 chairs, and the pushed-out one. I went back to the main room and sat down on the floor, not in a chair, on the floor with my back against the couch and my legs out in front of me and the flashlight lying beside me, still casting its beam at the ceiling. The house made sounds around me the way houses do, small creaks and shifts, the particular language of old wood and stone finding their positions for the night. Something settled inside me too. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind you'd put in a movie. More like a sound you hear in the walls when the temperature drops, something releasing, something finding where it belongs. I noticed the cardigan when I finally got up. It was hanging on the hook beside the front door, the one Eleanor had put there years ago, specifically for coats and bags. Because she said people always needed somewhere to put things when they first walked in. A cream-colored cardigan with wooden buttons. I didn't recognize it at first. Then I did. I stood in front of it for a moment without touching it. Then I lifted the collar and held it close enough to be sure, and it was still there, faint, almost gone, but present enough that I had to set my hand flat against the wall to keep my balance. Lavender, and something warmer underneath it that I didn't have a word for. This was the only thing left, the only thing in the world that was still mine. I didn't know yet that she had left it to me on purpose. 3 weeks before I stood in that cabin looking at Eleanor's cardigan, I was sitting in a courtroom, watching my son's attorney explain to a judge why I deserved nothing. The room was smaller than I'd expected. Wood paneling on the walls, fluorescent lights overhead, the kind of carpet that exists only in government buildings, a gray-brown color that belongs to no particular decade. I sat at the respondent's table in the suit I had worn to Eleanor's service 14 months earlier. It still fit mostly. I hadn't had a reason to buy another one. Derek's attorney was a man named Gerald Fitch, mid-40s, good shoes, the kind of voice that fills a room without effort. He had a habit of pausing after key phrases to let them land. Mr. Whitfield, he said, addressing the bench, spent the final 4 years of his wife's illness as her full-time caregiver. During that period, he held no employment, generated no income, and made no independent financial decisions of consequence. He paused. He is 61 years old. He has no professional certifications, no active employment history for the past 4 years, and no documented assets of his own. Another pause. He is by every practical measure financially dependent, and the court should recognize this reality when determining equitable distribution. I kept my eyes forward. My attorney, a man from a general practice firm 2 towns over who I'd found through an internet search, was scrolling something under the table on his phone. I could see the faint blue light reflecting off the edge of the desk. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. I looked instead at the window on the far wall. A strip of October sky, the color of old pewter. I had taught Derek to ride a bike on Clement Street 6 blocks from the house we'd lived in for 19 years. He was 7. He'd wanted to skip the training wheels entirely, which was a bad idea, but I'd let him try it his way first, because I knew he needed to find that out for himself. He fell 4 times. The 4th time he got up before I reached him. I thought about that a lot during the trial. I also thought about the February when he was 9 years old and ran a fever for 4 days straight. I slept on the floor of his bedroom, with a pillow from the hall closet waking every 2 hours to check on him. Eleanor brought soup. I read him the same chapter of the same book 3 nights in a row, because it was the only one he wanted. He was my son. That part hadn't changed. I wasn't sure what else to do with that fact, so I just held onto it and kept my eyes on the window. Carol took the stand near the end of the morning session. She wore a dark blouse and spoke carefully the way people do when they've thought about what they're going to say long before they're asked to say it. Her voice had the same warmth it always carried, the kind of warmth that sounds genuine until you start listening to the specific words. "James is a good man," she said. I've always believed that. But managing the property, handling accounts, planning for the future, that was always Eleanor's domain. James was never particularly involved in those kinds of decisions. The judge made a note. I didn't look at Carol directly. I looked at the table in front of me and listened to the words she chose and thought about how much thought had gone into choosing them. The decision came after lunch. Judge Harlan read from his notes in a flat, practiced voice. The marital home, a 4-bedroom colonial we'd spent 3 years renovating, went to Derek. The joint accounts, the retirement fund, The 2019 sedan. Various assets itemized on a sheet I had been given a copy of, 3 pages single-spaced. The cabin in Crestwood County was listed near the bottom of the second page. Property assessed at $47,000, rural limited access, asset value negligible. Derek's attorney made a small notation. Derek himself glanced at the line and looked away. From where I sat, I could see Carol in the back row give a slight lift of her shoulders, not quite a shrug, but close. I received a check for $14,500, representing my share of a joint savings account that had existed for 11 years. The handshake from Gerald Fitch lasted approximately 1 second. Ray was parked outside in his blue pickup engine running. He had waited the whole morning without being asked. That was Ray he didn't make things into, more than they were, which was exactly what I needed. I got in, closed the door. Through the windshield, I watched Derek and Carol walk out of the courthouse together. They were talking, not arguing, not serious, just talking the way two people talk when things have gone the way they planned. Carol said something, and Derek smiled. I looked down at the check in my hand. $14,500. 40 years of a life. 40 years of decisions, compromises, rooms shared, and rooms given up mornings and winters, and the kind of arguments you have with people you actually love. $14,500. Ray didn't ask right away. He waited until Derek's car had pulled out of the lot. Then he said quietly, "Where do you want to go?" I folded the check once and put it in my inside pocket. "Take me north," I said. "Eleanor's place." The first week wasn't about healing. It was about surviving the kind of ugly that nobody photographs. The mold was in the bathroom grout not a little, but the kind that sets in when a space has been sealed and left alone through 2 full summers. I discovered it at 2 a.m. on the second night, because I couldn't sleep and I needed something to do with my hands. I found a scrub brush under the sink and got on my knees on the tile floor working the grout section by section, with a paste mixed from baking soda and an old bottle of white vinegar. It took 2 hours. My knees ached by the end, but the grout came back not white, but close enough to see what it had once been. The water heater was original to the last renovation, older than it had any right to be. Every morning I turned the hot tap and waited. The pipes knocked. The water ran cold, then cool, then something approaching warm, and I stood there counting the minutes on the clock above the stove. 25 minutes. Every time, 25 minutes. By the 4th morning, I'd stopped counting and just started a task. While I waited, swept the porch, checked the window latches, and let the water sort itself out. The nearest grocery store was in Millhaven, 35 minutes south on a state road that lost cell service for the first 20 minutes of the drive. The first time I made the trip, I sat in Ray's truck and tried to calculate what I could spend. $14,500, minus gas, minus electricity through the winter, minus whatever the water heater eventually cost me. I didn't have a number for that last one, so I gave it a number I thought I could survive. I bought 12 cans of soup, a box of crackers, a bag of rice, and a half-gallon of whole milk. $61 and some change. I ate soup for 5 days straight, not because it was what I wanted, but because every dollar spent was a dollar I wouldn't have later, and I didn't yet know what later looked like. On the 3rd day, I called Carol. The phone rang 7 times before she picked up. James. Her voice had that particular quality, warm, measured as if she were genuinely glad to hear from me, and also somewhere slightly more important. "I am at the cabin," I said. "I know." A brief pause. "How are you holding up?" I told her I was managing. She asked if staying there long-term was realistic. I said I hadn't decided anything yet. She said gently, the way she said most things that Derek had mentioned, there was a room available if I needed something more practical. I said I appreciated it. Then I ended the call, set the phone face down on the kitchen table, and didn't pick it up again for the rest of the day. On the 5th day, I went through a box of Eleanor's things I'd found in the hall closet not to sort, not to throw away, just to touch. A scarf. A travel journal from a trip we'd taken to Vermont in 2009 pages, filled with her handwriting, which had always been smaller and more deliberate than mine. A ceramic mug with a chip in the rim that she'd refused to throw out because she liked the weight of it. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. The toolbox was under the kitchen sink. flat metal painted gray, the paint chipping at the edges. I opened it because the bathroom faucet had developed a drip I could hear from the hallway. Eleanor had labeled everything inside, not typed labels handwritten in her small, deliberate print on strips of masking tape pressed along the handles and shafts. Flathead, Phillips, 3/8 wrench, needle nose. The label on the hammer just said hammer, because Eleanor had a sense of humor about things that didn't require one. I fixed the bathroom faucet, then the latch on the back door. Then I climbed on a chair and worked the bedroom window back into its frame. It had warped and wouldn't close flush. 3 repairs in one afternoon, using tools my wife had labeled for me years before she knew I'd need them. I found the photograph near the bottom of the box, tucked inside an old issue of a regional magazine. Carol was in it, standing on the north slope above the lake, the same angle you'd see if you walked 20 minutes past the cabin and kept going up. She was next to a man I didn't recognize, tall, dark coat hands in his pockets, facing slightly away from the camera as if he hadn't known the photo was being taken. No date on the back, no caption, nothing written at all. I set the photograph in the kitchen drawer beneath the utility bills and the spare batteries and went back to cleaning. I didn't think much about it. Not then. By the 7th day, I had settled into something that wasn't routine exactly, but had the shape of one. I cleaned in the mornings, repaired in the afternoons, ate in the evenings without turning anything on. No background noise, no distraction. That afternoon, I started on the walls, wiping down the plaster with a damp cloth from the kitchen toward the hallway section by section. By the time I reached the staircase, the light through the western window had turned amber and long. I stopped in front of the largest painting Eleanor had ever made. I had never really looked at it before, not the way it deserved. She painted it in the last good autumn before the diagnosis. I remembered the afternoon she finished it. She came downstairs with oil paint on her forearm, a streak of amber and sienna she hadn't noticed, and set her brush in the jar on the kitchen counter and said, without any particular ceremony, "I think that's the most honest thing I've ever made." I'd said something like, "That's a high bar," and she'd smiled and poured herself a glass of water and gone back upstairs. I hadn't thought much about it at the time. I should have. The painting was 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, hung on the plaster wall beside the staircase, at a height that meant you had to look up slightly to take it in properly. It showed the maple forest on the north slope above the lake in full autumn color. Not the bright postcard version of fall foliage, but the deeper, more complicated version that happens in late October when the peak has passed and the colors have started to darken at the edges. Rust and ochre, and a particular shade of burnt orange that Eleanor seemed to find everywhere. The tree line reflected in the surface of Harlow Lake below, the reflection slightly distorted, the way still water always slightly distorts what it holds. She'd painted it from memory. She always did. She said photographs flatten things in ways she didn't trust. I stood in front of it for a long time, long enough for the light through the western window to shift slightly on the canvas. Then I reached up and lifted it from the wall. It was heavier than I expected, not by a little. The frame was solid oak. I hadn't realized that before. And the canvas backing was layered with something a stiffening board she must have added herself. It took both hands and a careful step backward to bring it down without hitting the banister. I set it against the opposite wall face out and started to turn back toward the staircase. And then I looked at the back. A manila envelope sealed flat against the back of the canvas with brown packing tape that had yellowed and gone slightly brittle with age. Pressed close edges flush the way someone had taken care with it. It had been there a long time. My full name was written across the front in Eleanor's handwriting. Not James. My full name the way she wrote it on forms and important things. Underneath in a smaller hand, a single line. If you are reading this, the last autumn has come. I sat down on the bottom step of the staircase. I held the envelope in both hands for a moment. It wasn't heavy, but it felt like it was. The packing tape made a sound like a quiet exhale when I worked the edge free. Inside 3 things, and then a 4th. A letter folded in thirds on plain white paper, written front and back in Eleanor's small, deliberate print. A silver key no larger than a house key with the letters EW engraved on the bow. A business card, cream-colored plain, font Frank Calloway attorney at Law Mill Haven, NH. And at the bottom of the envelope, a small black voice recorder. The kind you'd find in an office supply store, nothing special, rectangular, with a red play button on the face. I pressed the power tab. A small green light came on. The battery still had a charge. I read the letter first. Eleanor wrote the way she spoke without much preamble. She said she had been planning this for longer than I knew. She said the silver key belonged to a safe deposit box at First Covenant Bank in Millhaven, box 2241. She said a man named Frank Calloway had been her attorney for over 15 years, and that I should call him before I went to the bank. She wrote about land, not in detail, just enough to tell me that there was something to know, and that Frank in the box would explain the rest. She said she hadn't told me while she was alive, because she wanted to be the one to do it in person, and then she ran out of time, and she was sorry for that. Near the bottom of the second page, her handwriting changed slightly. Not much. Just the small variations that come when someone has been writing for a long time and is starting to reach the part they've been putting off. There is one more thing in the envelope, she wrote. I went back and forth about whether to leave it. In the end, I decided you needed to know the truth, all of it. Press play when you're ready. I'm sorry, James. I folded the letter back along its original creases and set it on the step beside me. I held the recorder in my right hand. The green light still blinked. The red button was slightly recessed the way those buttons are so you don't press it by accident. I sat there for a while. The house was quiet in the way old houses are quiet at night, not silent, but still. The wind outside moved through the maple trees the way it always does in October, a long and unhurried sound, neither beginning nor ending anywhere in particular. I pressed play. His voice came through the small speaker, the way something does when you already know it, but have never let yourself believe it. The timestamp on the recorder read June 14th, 4 months before Eleanor was gone. There were sounds before the voice, a chair being pulled across a hard floor, the uneven scrape of wooden legs on tile, something set down on a surface hollow, and brief the way a glass sounds when it's nearly empty. Then a pause, the ambient hiss of a quiet room, and Derek's voice. He wasn't angry. That was the first thing I noticed. He spoke the way people do when they've thought something through a long time, and no longer need to perform it for themselves. Yeah, and she won't last the year, he said. You know that? A pause. He never built anything. You did everything. The house, the accounts, the whole thing that was you, not him. And when you're gone, I'm going to take what's mine. The words came out evenly one after another, with the particular flatness of someone stating facts rather than arguments. He won't fight it. You know he won't. And even if he tries, he doesn't have anything to fight with. Then silence. Not the silence of someone who's finished speaking, the silence of someone else in the room who has chosen not to answer. Eleanor did not respond. No words, no movement, no sound I could identify as a reaction. The recorder caught only the ambient hiss of the room, the faint sound of wind maybe, or the heater, or nothing at all. 4 minutes and 17 seconds total. And then the recording ended. I sat on the bottom step and looked at the recorder in my hands. I did not move for a long time. There's a particular quality to certain kinds of shock, not the sudden physical kind, but the kind that settles in slowly, like cold water rising. You feel it first in the chest, then the hands, then somewhere behind the eyes, and then everything simply stops for a moment, like a clock that needs to be wound. I didn't cry, not right away. I just sat there looking at the recorder, listening to the absence of sound where Derek's voice had been. What came back to me wasn't a memory of Derek. It was Eleanor, not the Eleanor of the last year, not the hospital, not the difficult months. The Eleanor of an ordinary Thursday evening, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, one of the hundreds of evenings that had felt unremarkable at the time. We were at dinner. Derek had come for the weekend. He was in his mid-20s, then between jobs a little restless. He'd been talking most of the meal plans, ideas, grievances, the particular mix that defined that period of his life. I'd been half listening the way you do after a long day. At some point, I glanced at Eleanor. She was looking at Derek. Not unkindly, her face was calm, attentive the way she always appeared in public. But there was something else in her expression, something I had noticed and filed away without examining, something careful, something that knew. I hadn't understood it at the time. I understood it now. I went outside. The porch ran the full length of the front face, and the air was cold in the particular way. October air is cold at elevation, not bitter, but clean, the kind that makes indoor rooms feel suddenly too warm. I sat down in one of the rocking chairs and looked out at Harlow Lake. The water was black in the dark, the far tree line just visible as a slightly darker shade against the sky. No wind this time, the surface was flat and still holding nothing. I held the recorder in one hand and just sat. I don't know how long I stayed out there. Long enough for the cold to work through my jacket. Long enough to stop listening for sounds and just let the quiet be what it was. At some point, something shifted. Not a decision exactly, more like an understanding arriving without announcement. Eleanor had not made that recording out of anger. She wasn't the kind of person who kept things as weapons that wasn't who she was, and I had known her long enough to know the difference between who she was and who she wasn't. She had made it because she knew. She had known what was coming. She had known she wouldn't be there to stand beside me, and she had made sure the only way she still could that I would not be walking in blind. She had done it because she loved me. That was it. That was all of it. I went back inside when my hands had gone numb. That night, I lay in the bed we had shared for more years than I could count in the dark, and I held the silver key between my fingers. It was small and cold and solid in a way that seemed out of proportion to its size. At some point, I must have pressed it against my palm, because when I finally opened my hand in the early morning gray, there was a faint red mark across the skin where the metal had rested. One bank, one box, and whatever Eleanor had spent 38 years building without saying a word to anyone. I drove into Millhaven the next morning, 27 minutes on a state road that ran south through second-growth timber and open pasture. Main Street was 4 blocks long, a hardware store, a diner, a law office with an old sign, a post office that looked like it had been built in the same decade as the cabin. First Covenant Bank sat at the far end on the corner, brick and stone, a flag out front that the wind had wrapped loosely around its pole. I went in through the glass door and stood at the front counter. The teller was a woman in her 40s, efficient-looking with reading glasses on a lanyard. I told her I was there about a safe deposit box. She asked the number. When I said 2241, something shifted in her expression. Not alarm, not recognition, exactly. But the faint adjustment that happens when a person hears something they've been half expecting. She asked me to wait one moment, and then she picked up an internal phone and turned slightly away. Daniel Marsh came out from the back corridor 2 minutes later. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, the build of someone who had been athletic once and still carried himself that way out of habit. He wore a plain gray suit, no tie, a white shirt buttoned to the collar. He crossed the lobby at an unhurried pace, offered his hand, and said, "You must be James." I said I was. "I'm Daniel Marsh, branch manager." He paused just briefly. "Eleanor mentioned you'd come eventually. I didn't know when." He said it the way someone says something they've had prepared for a while, not rehearsed, but considered. There was care in it, not the performed sympathy of someone who deals in condolences, but the precision of a man who understood that some things deserved accurate words. "But this way," he said. The safe deposit vault was in the lower level, down a short flight of stairs. Through a locked door Gerald opened with a key from his ring. The room was cool and fluorescent rows of metal boxes along both walls, the kind of space designed to feel permanent. Box 2241 was in the middle of the right wall. Larger than I'd expected, not the small personal box I'd imagined, but a full-size unit 12 inches wide, nearly 2 feet long. Daniel stood back and gave me the room to work. The silver key turned on the first try. Inside, a bound file folder, rubber-banded. A second envelope sealed with my name on the front, in the same handwriting I'd been living with for the past week. And a brown leather notebook, well-worn, the kind with a strap of elastic cord threaded around the cover to hold it closed. I set them on the small table provided against the wall and opened the file folder first. 7 documents. Each one was a deed formal county, stamped the kind of legal record that doesn't look like much until you understand what you're holding. Each one described a different parcel of land in Crestwood County. Each one listed Eleanor Whitfield as the acquiring party. I went through them slowly. The parcels ran in a rough arc around Harlow Lake, north face, south, ridge, east, inlet, a section of the western timber slope I recognized from years of walking it. Together, they formed something I was only beginning to understand the shape of. I found the assessment summary at the back of the folder, a single sheet issued by the county assessor's office dated the previous spring. I read the number once. I put the paper face down on the table. Then I placed both hands flat on the surface and held them there. The table was cold brushed metal, the temperature of the room, and I pressed my palms against it and just breathed for a moment. 310 acres, 38 years. Daniel came back in quietly. He stood near the door, gave me a moment, and then said, "She was meticulous about all of it. Every payment, every renewal, every filing." He paused. 30 years of records in that folder, not a single one missed. I looked up at him. "Not once," he said. He didn't add anything to it. He didn't need to. I turned back to the table and picked up the leather notebook. The elastic strap had worn a shallow groove in the cover from years of use. I worked it free and open to the first page. The handwriting was Eleanor's smaller and more careful than her letters, the way people write when they intend something to last. The first line read, 1984, 28 acres north of the lake, $11,000, 2 years of teaching salary. And then at the end of the line, 3 words separated from the rest by a dash. James didn't know. I sat with that for a moment. 3 words. I had known Eleanor Whitfield for 38 years. I had eaten breakfast with her, argued with her about things that no longer mattered, held her through the worst years of her life. I had believed without ever examining the belief that I understood the broad outline of her. 3 words written in her handwriting in a notebook she'd kept for 4 decades had rearranged the outline entirely. Daniel brought me a cup of coffee without being asked and pointed me toward a small conference room at the back of the building, 4 walls a window that looked onto an alley, a rectangular table with 6 chairs that had probably not all been used at the same time in years. I spread everything out on the table, the file folder on the left, the sealed envelope in the center. I wasn't ready for that one yet. The leather notebook on the right opened to the first page. I started from the beginning. The notebook was not a diary. There were no descriptions of how Eleanor had felt on any given day, no accounts of conversations or seasons, or the ordinary texture of a life. What she had made instead was a record precise, purposeful, the kind of document a careful person constructs when they intend it to be used by someone else. Each entry followed the same structure: a year, a parcel description, an acreage, a dollar amount, a source of funds. Occasionally a single observation, nothing more. The first entry I had already read in the vault. I turned past it and went on. 1989, 35 acres East Approach Corridor, $19,500. Below it, in parentheses, first timber harvest, north section. Reforested entirely the following spring. I stopped on that one for a moment. She had bought the 1984 parcel, and then 5 years later, harvested timber from it carefully, apparently, because the note was specific about reforestation, and used that income to buy the next parcel. The land had paid for itself, and then she had planted back what she'd taken. I read the line again, reforested entirely the following spring. Eleanor had always kept a list on the refrigerator of things she intended to do and hadn't gotten to yet. The list changed every few months. Some items cycled off and came back. I had always assumed her approach to things was approximate optimistic, loosely organized. I had been wrong about that too. 1997, 42 acres including the North Ridge Line, $31,000. Below funded, from 1989, parcel income, second harvest cycle. No personal funds used. She had been running a quiet, self-sustaining operation for over a decade by then, buying land, managing it, generating income from it, using that income to buy more. No loans, no outside investors. No one's name on anything except the entity she had eventually created to hold it all. Harlow Land Trust, established 2003, read the entry at the top of that year's page. All parcels transferred. James Whitfield named sole beneficiary. Below that, a single sentence. He will not understand why I didn't tell him. I hope eventually he will. I set the notebook down for a moment and looked at the window. The alley outside was narrow and quiet. A sparrow sat on the edge of a drain pipe and then left. She had put my name on all of it. While I was driving her to appointments, while I was learning which medications needed to be taken with food and which ones couldn't be combined, while I was sleeping in hospital chairs and figuring out which grocery stores stayed open latest, she had been maintaining a land trust with my name on it. I picked the notebook back up. The entries continued through the 2000s in the same measured cadence, small acquisitions, careful notes, the occasional observation about a neighboring parcel or a county zoning change. Nothing dramatic. The work of someone who was paying close attention over a very long time. The last entry with a transaction was from 2014. After that, the pages contained only notes, assessments she had requested, correspondence she had summarized in a few lines. A clipping from a county planning newsletter, folded and tucked inside the back cover, about proposed development interests near Harlow Lake. And then near the back of the notebook, a page dated 2019. The handwriting on this page was slightly different. Not worse, just more deliberate, as if she had thought carefully before putting each word down. Derek came by today asking about the land. He had numbers with him, projections. He spoke about it the way people speak about things they've already decided belong to them. A line break, then. He thinks I don't understand what he's doing. I understand exactly. Another break. James will need this more than Derek deserves it. And below that, in smaller letters, a second note that appeared to have been added. Later, the ink slightly different, the hand a degree more careful. If he reaches the land before James does, Maggie will know what to do. I read that line twice. Maggie. I didn't know a Maggie. Not in Millhaven, not in Crestwood County, not anywhere in the geography of Eleanor's life that I was aware of. But Eleanor had written the name as if it required no introduction, as if whoever Maggie was, she had already been told, as if the arrangement had already been made. I closed the notebook and held it in both hands for a moment. Then I set it on top of the file folder, gathered everything carefully into the canvas bag Daniel had provided, and went to find him to say goodbye. He walked me to the door. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "The box stays as long as you want it." I thanked him and drove back north. That evening, I made something that wasn't canned soup for the first time, pasta, from a box I'd found in the back of the pantry, with olive oil and salt. I ate at the kitchen table without turning anything on. Afterward, I sat in the armchair by the front window and read through the file folder once more slowly, until I had the shape of it clearly in my mind. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, Carol called. She called while I was still in the kitchen. I had been standing at the counter with a second cup of coffee, looking out the window at the frost on the grass, the first real frost of the season, thin and white, covering the ground between the cabin and the tree line. The phone rang and I picked it up without checking the screen. James, Carol's voice, warm, unhurried the way it always was. "I've been thinking about you. How are you holding up out there?" I told her I was fine. "Derek's been worried," she said. "We both have. It's a long way out and winter's coming on." A brief pause. "Have you thought at all about what comes next, practically speaking?" I said I was still figuring things out. "Of course." Another pause, shorter. "There is one thing, and I want to be straightforward with you about this, James, because I think you deserve that." Her voice stayed warm. It always stayed warm. Derek's accountant raised a concern about the farm. The way it's currently titled with the estate still unsettled, there could be tax complications down the line. Nothing catastrophic, but the kind of thing that gets messier if it's left. I waited. If you were willing to sign a straightforward transfer just to simplify the title, it would take that off the table. Derek would handle all the paperwork. You wouldn't need to do anything except sign. "I'm not going to do that," I said. A brief silence. Then, "I understand. I just wanted to raise it while there was still time to handle it cleanly." Her tone hadn't changed, not by a degree. "No pressure at all, James. I just want what's best for everyone." I said I appreciated it. Then I ended the call and set the phone face up on the kitchen table. I stood at the window for another minute watching the frost. Then I thought about the photograph. I went to the kitchen drawer and found it where I had left it 2 weeks earlier, tucked under the utility bills and the spare batteries. I pulled it out and carried it to the table, where the morning light was better. I had looked at it before, but quickly the way you look at something when you're not yet sure it matters. Now, I looked at it properly, Carol was on the left side of the frame, standing on the north hillside above the lake. She was wearing a jacket I recognized, a light tan field jacket she'd had for years, the kind with the flap pockets on the chest. She was turned slightly to the right, one arm extended, pointing towards something in the middle distance. The gesture was specific, not the vague wave of someone indicating a general direction, but the deliberate point of someone identifying a particular location. The man beside her was tall, wearing a dark coat. Carrying what I could now see clearly was a folded survey map, the kind with topographic lines, the kind you get from a county land office. He was holding it open with both hands, looking in the direction Carol was pointing. I did not recognize him, but I recognized the hillside. It was the north slope above Harlow Lake, the same slope that appeared in Eleanor's notebook as the location of the 1984 purchase, the same slope that formed the northern boundary of the Harlow Land Trust. I sat down at the table and thought back. Carol had first asked me about the cabin the previous spring, casually over the phone, in the middle of a conversation about something else. She'd mentioned that property values in rural counties were rising, and asked if I'd ever thought about what the place was actually worth. I had said something vague and changed the subject, because it was Eleanor's place, and the question had felt strange to me, though I hadn't examined why. She had asked again at Eleanor's service. Gently, briefly, she was good at briefly. Whether I planned to keep it, whether there was any sentimental attachment that would make it difficult to let go. I had not counted the times before today. Standing in my kitchen with the photograph on the table, I tried to count them now and found I couldn't get to the bottom of the list. I called Ray. He picked up on the second ring. "I need to ask you something," I said. "Ask." "How long can I keep the truck?" A pause, but not a hesitant one. Ray's pauses were always the kind where he was already deciding something he'd already made up his mind about. "How long do you need it?" "I don't know yet," I said. "Then keep it as long as you want. I'll manage." A brief silence. "You doing all right up there?" I told him I thought I was starting to figure some things out. He said that sounded like a yes and let it go at that. I put the photograph in the inside pocket of my jacket, not back in the drawer, in my pocket where I could find it easily. That evening I ate at the kitchen table and read through the notebook entries one more time. Not the numbers this time, but the margins. The small observations Eleanor had made about zoning changes in county meetings, and the one entry in 2008 that mentioned a developer who had approached her about the western parcel. She had written simply, "declined." One word, no explanation. I closed the notebook and looked at the window. The next morning I drove half a mile up the logging track to the White House with green shutters. Eleanor had written, "Maggie will know what to do." She opened the door before I knocked. I had my hand raised to knuckles an inch from the wood when the door swung inward and Margaret Oakes stood in the frame, a woman in her mid-60s, compact and steady, with gray hair cut short and the kind of face that has spent a long time outdoors. She looked at me the way people look at someone they've been expecting for a while, without knowing exactly when. "You look like a man who just read something he can't unread," she said. "Is it that obvious?" "Come inside," she said. I just made coffee. The kitchen was warm. In a way, the cabin was still working toward the particular warmth of a room with a wood-burning stove going, and something on the counter that smelled of cinnamon, a cast-iron pan on the back burner, a row of ceramic mugs on hooks above the window, a braided rug on the floor, worn soft from years of use. She poured 2 cups without asking how I took mine, set them on the table, and sat down across from me. "Eleanor told me you'd come eventually," she said. "She said it might take you a while to find the notebook." "It was behind the painting," I said. Maggie nodded as if that confirmed something. "That sounds like her?" She had known Eleanor for 19 years, since the spring Eleanor and I had done the first round of repairs on the cabin, and Maggie had appeared at the fence line with a jar of pickled vegetables, and the general demeanor of someone who intended to be a neighbor in the full sense of the word. They had fallen into the kind of friendship that doesn't require constant maintenance, the kind where months could pass without a conversation, and nothing was lost when they picked it back up. "She never talked much about the land with me," Maggie said. "Not directly, but she talked around it the way she talked around things that mattered to her. She'd mention a parcel or a county meeting she'd attended, and I'd ask and she'd say, 'Oh, it's nothing, just something I'm keeping an eye on.' A brief smile. Eleanor kept a lot of things under quiet supervision. I asked if Eleanor had ever talked about me. Maggie looked at her cup for a moment. Then she said you trusted people too easily, that it was one of the things she loved most about you. Another pause, and that it was the thing that worried her most. I didn't say anything. She didn't mean it as a criticism, Maggie said. I think you know that. There was a moment of quiet, the kind that settles between people when something true has just been said, and neither party needs to elaborate on it. Then Maggie set down her cup and folded her hands on the table. There's something I've been holding on to, she said. I've been waiting until it was the right time to tell someone. I think you're the right someone, and I think this is the right time. She told me about the week Eleanor was in the hospital for the last time. It was in October 2 years ago. Eleanor had been admitted on a Monday, a decline they had been watching for. The doctors had said not a surprise, but still a threshold. I had been at the hospital every day. I remembered the week clearly, the particular quality of hospital light, the sound of the hallway, the chair I'd slept in on the third night. What I had not known was what was happening back at the cabin. On the Wednesday of that week, Maggie had been working in her yard when she saw a car come up the logging track, a car she didn't recognize. It parked near the cabin gate. 2 men got out. One of them she recognized after a moment, Derek. The other man, she didn't know. He was tall, dark coat. He was carrying what looked like a rolled document, a map or a survey. They walked the property line for nearly an hour. The perimeter of the north field, the ridge above the lake, the eastern fence. Derek moved the way someone moves when they're not visiting a place, but assessing it, measuring with his eyes, stopping to note distances, pointing at landmarks. They did not go to the hospital that day. Maggie had gone inside and called Eleanor. I didn't know what to say exactly, Maggie told me. I described what I'd seen. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Maggie paused. When I finished, there was a silence. And then she said, "Thank you, Maggie. Now I know what I need to do." That was all. But I knew Eleanor well enough to know what that tone meant. She looked at me steadily. 2 days later, her attorney came to the hospital. The man from Millhaven, Frank Calloway. I said I knew who he was. She had him bring something, a file, I think. She signed things. Maggie picked up her cup, considered it, set it back down. She didn't tell me the details, but she called me that evening from her hospital room, which she almost never did, and she said she'd taken care of something that needed taking care of. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the stove. He came to the land, Maggie said, before he came to her bedside. She said it plainly without drama. She told me that herself. Those were the last words she ever said to me about it. I drove back down the hill in Ray's truck, with the heater running and the windows beginning to fog at the edges. My phone was on the passenger seat. I picked it up at the bottom of the track to check the road conditions and saw the screen. 2 missed calls, Derek's number, both of them one while I'd been sitting in Maggie's kitchen, one while I'd been on the logging track coming down. I set the phone back on the seat face down. I did not call back. It was a Saturday morning 5 days after I came back from Maggie's. He didn't call ahead. Of course he didn't. I heard the vehicle before I saw it, tires on gravel, the particular sound of something heavier than Ray's truck coming up the track at a pace that wasn't hurrying, but wasn't being careful either. I was on the porch with a cup of coffee when the silver pickup came around the bend in the tree line and parked at the gate. Derek got out. He was dressed down from the last time I'd seen him. No blazer, just dark jeans and a gray canvas jacket, the kind of deliberate casual that still looks like it was considered. He walked up the path with his hands in his pockets and a particular set to his shoulders that I recognized. It was the posture of someone who had decided how a conversation was going to go before it started. "Dad." He stopped at the base of the porch steps. "You look better than I expected. Coffee's inside if you want some," I said. He shook his head slightly. "I'm fine." He looked at the cabin, then back at me. A brief survey quickly done. "How are you holding up out here?" "I'm managing," I said. A nod. "Good." He took one step up onto the porch, not asking, not waiting to be invited, just moving into the space the way he always had. I wanted to come by, check in. Another pause shorter. I know things didn't go the way either of us wanted in court. I held my cup with both hands and waited. He got to it on the third sentence. I know about Pinnacle Group, he said. I know about the land. He said it without buildup, as if he were reporting something we both already understood. I've been aware of it for a while, Dad. And I think if we approach this the right way together, there's something real here for both of us. I didn't say anything. This is family property in a sense. Mother's land, yes, but family. And if Pinnacle is already circling, then the window to get ahead of this is now. He shifted his weight slightly. His voice had the cadence of someone who had practiced the speech not enough to make it obvious, but enough that the seams showed if you were listening for them. I'm not talking about taking anything from you. I'm talking about doing this right with people on your side who understand what's involved. He paused and looked at me. If we're family, he said, we can work this out. I looked at him for a moment. There's a particular thing that happens when you stop wanting something from a conversation. The other person keeps moving toward where they thought you were standing, and you've already stepped aside, and there's a brief moment where you can see everything clearly before they notice. I know about the maps, Derek, I said. He didn't move. I know about the week your mother was in the hospital, the last time. I set my cup down on the porch railing slowly. I know you came up here. I know you walked the property line. I know what you were carrying. Something shifted in his face, a tightening around the jaw, a brief stillness in the eyes. He recovered quickly the way someone does when they've trained themselves to recover quickly, but not quickly enough that I missed it. The dad, go home, Derek. The words came out even and flat, no rise in them, no heat. I picked my cup back up. He stood there for a moment. Then he turned and took 2 steps toward the porch stairs. He stopped. He didn't turn all the way around just enough. You don't know what you're getting into, he said. The calculated quality was gone from his voice. What was left was something flatter and more tired. You think you do, you don't. I've read every deed in the file, I said. I know exactly what I'm getting into. He stood on the step for another moment. Then he walked to his truck, got in, and drove back down the track without looking back. I watched the silver hood disappear behind the tree line. I went inside and called Frank Calloway. He picked up on the second ring. It started, I said. There was a brief pause on his end, not surprise, just the pause of a man who keeps his reactions to himself until he's ready for them. I know, he said. His attorney called me this morning. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the window. The frost from earlier in the week had gone. The grass between the cabin and the tree line was flat and dull in the mid-morning light, the color of something waiting for winter to decide what came next. What did they say? I asked. Nothing specific yet. They're feeling out the situation. Another pause. James, do you have somewhere you can be tomorrow afternoon? I think we should talk in person. Yeah, I said I did. I set the phone on the counter and finished my coffee standing at the window. Outside, the track was empty. Just tire marks in the gravel where the silver pickup had been. Frank called on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after Derek left my porch. His voice was steady, clinical, the tone he uses when the news is worse than expected. I was standing in Eleanor's kitchen halfway through my second cup of coffee, watching a pale November sky press down on Harlow Lake. The phone buzzed in my hand. I answered on the second ring. They filed this morning, Frank said. 2 motions. The first is a revised will allegedly signed by Eleanor 7 months before she died. It names Derek as sole heir and explicitly excludes you from any inheritance. I set the coffee cup down on the counter, felt the cold edge of the granite under my palm. Eleanor never signed that, Frank continued. I have her medical schedule for that entire month. She was in treatment 3 days a week. There's no window where she could have met with a notary alone, let alone signed a document of that complexity. I didn't speak. I let him finish. The second motion is a temporary restraining order. Derek claims you've been interfering with estate property and requests the court bar you from the cabin, pending resolution of the will dispute. If the judge grants it, you'd be required to vacate within 72 hours and remain at least 500 feet away until the case is resolved. That one landed harder. The cabin, Eleanor's place, the only ground I'd stood on in weeks that felt like mine, could be taken from me before the week was out. How long do I have? I asked. It's 72 hours to file a counter motion. If we don't respond, the restraining order becomes enforceable by default. After that, if you set foot on the property, Derek can have you arrested for contempt. I closed my eyes, breathed slowly. Eleanor's voice surfaced in my memory, calm and deliberate. Frank keeps the brown cabinet fourth drawer, green tin box. If anything happens, that's where you start. I opened my eyes. Eleanor left instructions, I said. She told me about a file, something she called the contingency file. She said it was at your office. There was a pause. Then Frank's voice shifted sharper, now more alert. Hold on! I heard him set the phone down, the muffled sound of a drawer opening, papers rustling. A full minute passed. When he came back on the line, his tone had changed completely. James, he said quietly, she prepared for this. What's in it? Legal opinions from 3 independent firms confirming the Harlow Land Trust's validity. Notarized declarations stating you had no knowledge of the trust during any legal proceedings. Affidavits from 2 witnesses who were present when Eleanor established the trust in 2003, and a pre-drafted response to a restraining order motion, complete with supporting exhibits and case citations. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Frank continued, "There's also a reserve fund. Eleanor set aside $14,500 specifically to cover document examination and legal costs if Derek challenged the estate. She opened a separate escrow account in 2019 and left instructions for me to access it only if this exact scenario occurred. I thought of the check I'd received after the courtroom, the one I'd thought was all I had left. Eleanor had matched it penny for penny and hidden it in a lawyer's filing cabinet for a war she hoped would never come. She also left instructions for handwriting analysis," Frank said. 3 independent examiners, all court certified. The fund covers their fees in full. We'll need 3 to 4 weeks for a complete report, but if the signature on Derek's will is forged, and I believe it is, they'll prove it beyond any reasonable doubt. And the restraining order, we file tonight. I'll submit Eleanor's pre-drafted response along with the notarized declarations and witness affidavits. The judge will see that you had no knowledge of the trust, no financial motive to interfere with the estate, and that Derek's motion is retaliatory. I turned from the window, looked at Eleanor's desk in the next room. She'd sat there for decades, writing in ledgers, filing deeds, preparing for a war she hoped would never come. And when it did come, she'd already won half the battles before the first shot was fired. "Frank," I said slowly, "what's Derek's real strategy here? Delay. He doesn't need to win the will contest. He just needs to freeze everything long enough to wear you down. If he can keep you tied up in court for 6 months a year, burning through savings, he's betting you'll settle, walk away." I was quiet for a long moment, thinking of Derek on the porch 3 days ago. He'd come to measure the distance between us to see how much fight I had left. He'd miscalculated. File everything," I said, "tonight." "Understood. I'll call you tomorrow morning with confirmation. In the meantime, stay at the cabin. Don't leave. Don't give Derek any excuse to claim you've abandoned the property." "I'm not going anywhere," I said. I hung up. The restraining order sat between me and Eleanor's house, like a wall I couldn't see yet. But Eleanor had built a door through it years ago and left the key in a filing cabinet I'd never opened. I stood on the porch looking out over the lake. Somewhere out there, Derek was waiting for me to break to leave, to let him have what he thought was his. But Eleanor had been waiting longer. I went back inside. There was work to do. That afternoon, I went into Eleanor's study. The room was small, tucked into the northeast corner of the cabin, where morning light came in, low and soft. She'd painted here on winter afternoons when the porch was too cold, her easel angled toward the single window that looked out over the ridgeline. The air still smelled faintly of linseed oil and old wood, the kind of smell that doesn't fade even after someone's been gone for months. Her desk was oak heavy, older than our marriage. 4 drawers on the left side, each one deeper than the last. I'd opened them 100 times over the years, tax forms, old bills, receipts she kept for reasons I never questioned. But I'd never pulled the 4th drawer all the way out. I did now. Behind a stack of manila folders marked Property Tax 2018 to 2021 sat a small green tin box about the size of a hardcover book. It had a brass clasp on the front locked. Taped to the underside of the drawer in a sealed envelope was a single brass key. I peeled the tape carefully open the envelope. The key was warm in my hand. I carried the tin box to Eleanor's desk, set it down under the window, and unlocked it. Inside were layers of documents, each one separated by a thin sheet of wax paper to keep the pages from sticking together. The first thing I saw was a bound legal report stamped with a New York law firm seal and dated September 2019. The title read, Opinion on the Validity and Enforceability of the Harlow Land Trust. I skimmed the summary page. The conclusion was clear: the trust was legally sound, fully enforceable, and could not be contested on grounds of undue influence or lack of testamentary capacity. Beneath it was a second report from a Boston trust law specialist dated March 2020, reaching the same conclusion. A third report from a Millhaven attorney I didn't recognize was dated June 2021. Eleanor had paid 3 separate firms to confirm what she already knew. Beneath the legal opinions was a single-page affidavit signed and notarized in October 2022, years before Eleanor died. It read, I, Eleanor Rose Whitfield, declare under penalty of perjury that my husband James Arthur Whitfield has had no knowledge of the Harlow Land Trust, its contents, or its beneficiary designation at any point during our marriage or during any legal proceedings involving our son, Derek Whitfield. This declaration is made to protect James from allegations of conspiracy, fraud, or collusion. Her signature sat at the bottom, small and deliberate. I read it twice. She'd known Derek would accuse me. She'd known, and she'd written this to stop him before he could. The next layer was thicker. 23 pages of Eleanor's notarized signatures collected over 18 years. Each one was dated, witnessed sealed. Some were from land purchases, others from trust amendments. A few were from medical consent forms during her treatment. I understood immediately. If someone tried to forge Eleanor's signature on a fake will, these pages would prove it. Any handwriting expert could compare them line by line, loop by loop, and show the forgery for what it was. She'd built an unbreakable chain of authenticity, one signature at a time. Beneath the signatures was a letter, 3 pages handwritten, dated October 14th, 2020. Her handwriting was steady here. This was before the tremor started, before the treatments wore her down. The letter began, James, if you are reading this, then the last autumn has come, and I am not there to see it with you. I did not tell you about the land because I did not want you to carry the weight of it while I was alive. I did not want Derek to see you as an obstacle. I did not want our home to become a courtroom before it had to. She went on to explain how she'd bought the first parcel in 1984 with money she'd saved from teaching, how she'd funded each purchase by selling timber from the prior parcel and reinvesting the profit, never using our savings, never using my income. Over 38 years, she'd bought 310 acres piece by piece around Harlow Lake. She'd placed everything in a trust and named me as sole beneficiary because, as she wrote, I trust you to protect it. She knew Derek, she loved him, but she also knew what he would try to do. And she knew I would not fight him unless she gave me the tools to win without cruelty. This box contains those tools, she wrote. I hope you never need them. I hope Derek comes to you with open hands and an honest heart. But if he does not, if he tries to take what is not his or to destroy what I built, then you must not let him. Not because you owe me, but because the land deserves better. I love you, James. I always have. Eleanor. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into its sleeve. My hands were steady. My chest was not. At the bottom of the tin box, rolled and bound with a rubber band, was a hand-drawn map. I spread it across Eleanor's desk. It showed Harlow Lake from above every ridgeline, every inlet, every access road. 38 parcels were outlined in pencil, each one labeled with a year and an acreage figure. 1984, 28 acres North Shore. 1989, 35 acres East Corridor. 1997, 42 acres Ridgeline. 2003, 18 acres Southern Access. On and on, year after year, until the lake was surrounded. In the top corner in Eleanor's handwriting, she'd written 310 acres, 38 years, for James. I pinned the map to the wall above her desk, where her paintings used to hang. Then I sat down, picked up the phone, and called Frank. "Everything's here," I said. "Good," Frank replied. "Then we file the countermotion tonight, and James." "Yeah, 3 weeks. That's how long it'll take for the handwriting analysis. After that, we'll know for certain whether Derek forged that will." I looked at the map on the wall at the 38 years Eleanor had spent building something I never knew existed. 3 weeks, I repeated. 3 weeks, Frank said. I hung up. The countdown had begun. 3 weeks is a long time when you're sitting on something you can't touch. I learned to fill the hours. The easiest thing I found was Eleanor's easel. It had been folded flat and stored in the hall closet since before I'd arrived. I'd moved it twice without thinking much about it. On the 4th day of waiting, I unfolded it on the porch and set up a canvas I found in the closet's upper shelf, still in its plastic wrapping. Eleanor kept a wooden box of oils on the shelf below the paintings. I opened it, found the brushes in reasonable condition, and set up the way I imagined she used to. Then I stood in front of the canvas and discovered I had no idea what I was doing. The first attempt at the lake looked like what would happen if you described a lake to someone who had never seen water. The trees along the far bank came out rounded and oversized, more like heads of broccoli than anything that grows in New Hampshire. The color of the water was wrong, in a way I couldn't explain, too blue in the middle and too dark at the edges, like something from a travel poster for a place that doesn't exist. I looked at it for a long time, then I set down the brush and went inside and made coffee and came back out and looked at it again. I kept it. I painted every day after that. Not because I got better quickly, I didn't, but because it was the one activity that required me to look at the lake instead of thinking about what was happening in Frank's office. My hands stopped shaking somewhere around the 5th day. I hadn't realized they'd been shaking until they stopped. Maggie came by on a Thursday afternoon, in the second week unannounced, with a jar of something she'd put up herself, and no apparent intention of staying long. She stood on the porch and looked at the canvas on the easel, a second attempt at the lake somewhat better than the first, in the sense that the trees now resembled trees, though only approximately. She didn't say anything about the quality. Eleanor used to say painting wasn't about making something beautiful, she said after a moment. She said it was about looking at something long enough to actually see it. Did she say how long that took? Maggie picked up the jar from the railing where she'd set it. She said the seeing came when you stopped trying to make it look like something and just let it be what it was. A brief pause. I always thought she was talking about more than painting. She left after 20 minutes. I stood on the porch with the jar of preserves and looked at the canvas. Frank called on the afternoon of the 12th day. "Derek withdrew the filing this morning," he said. I sat down in the armchair near the window. All 3 examiners reached the same finding. The signature doesn't match not the physical characteristics, not the pen pressure, not the formation of the letters. The document was produced after Eleanor's passing and backdated. A pause. His attorneys advised him that proceeding to a hearing would create a public record of the determination. Withdrawing keeps it out of that record. But the determination still exists, I said. The determination still exists. It's documented, it's on file, and if it ever becomes relevant again, it's there. Another pause. He avoided the hearing. He didn't erase what happened. I looked at the window, outside the porch railing. Beyond it, the lake. "What about Pinnacle?" I said. Frank's tone shifted slightly the way it did when he was moving from one kind of information to another. "Victor Hale has called 5 times this week. Their financial approval window closes in 5 months. They need a decision in order to move forward with investors. A beat. You're going to need to be in a room with these people soon, James." I know, I said. "Set the meeting." He came back on a Thursday. I didn't hear the truck until it was already at the end of the drive. By the time I got to the kitchen window, the silver pickup was parked at the gate engine, running no one getting out. Derek sat behind the wheel. I could see him clearly from where I stood, both hands on the wheel looking at the cabin, not moving. He stayed that way for 2 minutes, I counted, without planning to. Then he put the truck in reverse and backed down the track the way he'd come, without turning around. I stood at the window for a while after he'd gone. If he had come up to the porch, I would have known what to do. I'd done it before. But this, the engine idling at the gate, the long look at the house. The deliberate decision not to approach was something different. It was the behavior of a person who was calculating rather than acting, who was waiting for something or deciding on something or both. I went back to the easel. Frank called again that evening. "Before you walk into that room," he said, "there's a name you need to know." A pause. "Someone made first contact with Pinnacle Group 7 years ago, before Eleanor passed, before any of the legal proceedings started." His voice was careful. "You need to see this in writing. I'm sending it over tonight." I looked at the map on the study wall. "Oh," I said. "Come to the office tomorrow," Frank said. "You should see it yourself." On the 12th day of waiting, I drove to Frank's office in Millhaven. He had the papers laid out on the table before I sat down, 3 neat stacks organized the way Frank organized things he considered important. No preamble. He gestured to the chair across from him and let me look. "Start with the top of the left stack," he said. The documents were internal records from Pinnacle Group correspondence meeting, summaries of contact log going back 7 years. Frank had received them through a legal disclosure request, the kind that takes weeks and produces boxes of material that mostly turns out to be irrelevant. This had not been irrelevant. I worked through the pages slowly. The language was corporate and impersonal, the kind that reduces everything to project names and contact categories and acquisition timelines. I had to read a few pages before I understood what I was looking at. The Harlow Lake project, not named that, but described in terms I recognized, had first appeared in Pinnacle's internal records in the spring of 2017. That was the initial contact date. The project had been flagged as a long-term acquisition target with significant development potential, a private lake, substantial acreage, and a low-density county, minimal existing infrastructure. Whoever had brought it to Pinnacle's attention had described it with a level of specificity that suggested first-hand knowledge of the property. I turned to the contact log. Under Initial Contact Regional Liaison, a name. Carol Merritt, Regional Land Consultant. Initial Contact, March 2017. I set the page down. Frank didn't say anything. He let me work through it. Carol had approached Pinnacle Group 7 years ago, in the spring of 2017, when Eleanor was still alive, when our marriage was still intact. When I was still driving Eleanor to appointments and managing her medication schedule and believing that the most complicated thing in my life was watching the person I loved become someone who needed more help than she wanted to ask for. While that was happening, Carol Merritt had been in contact with a major development group about a piece of land she didn't own and had no claim to. She didn't know about the trust, Frank said, reading the question before I asked it. Nothing in any of this indicates she was aware the land was held by the Harlow Land Trust. She assumed it was in Eleanor's name personally, that it would pass through the estate to Derek as a straightforward inheritance. She thought Derek would inherit it outright, I said, and that with the right legal pressure you'd be left with nothing to contest it with. A pause. She wasn't wrong about the logic, she just didn't know about Eleanor. He let that land. Then she didn't leave the marriage because it was over James. She left because she needed Derek to be the only heir. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the photograph. I had been carrying it since the day I'd looked at it again in the kitchen, since the morning I'd recognized the hillside and understood the gesture Carol was making in it. I set it on the table in front of Frank. He looked at it for a moment without touching it. Then he leaned forward slightly. "The man with the map," I said. Frank looked up. "That's Victor Hale." A pause. 7 years ago by the look of it. I had known by that point what the photograph most likely meant. Having Frank confirm it was different from knowing. It closed something off a small remaining space where an alternative explanation might have existed. I sat back in the chair. The silence lasted a while. Frank didn't try to fill it. I thought about the years of questions. Carol at Eleanor's service asking whether I planned to keep the farm. Carol on the phone the previous spring, mentioning that rural property values were rising. Carol over dinners and phone calls across how many years I tried to count back. At least 8, Frank had said, but the questions had probably started before she made the first call to Pinnacle. She had been gathering information the way you gather it when you're building towards something, gently. One question at a time. Nothing that would raise concern on its own. How long had she known what this land was worth? I asked. At least 8 years, Frank said. based on what's in here. He gestured to the papers. Probably longer. The level of detail in her initial contact with Pinnacle wasn't guesswork. She had done her research. I thought about Derek. Not the Derek who had stood on my porch with a practice speech about family and cooperation. The Derek before that. The Derek who had grown up watching his mother approach the world as a series of assets and liabilities, of positions and advantages, of things that belonged to someone and could therefore be acquired. Carol hadn't simply used Derek for this. She had spent years teaching him to see things the way she saw them, to look at a property and calculate its value rather than its meaning, to look at a family arrangement and identify its weaknesses. What Derek had become, he had not become on his own. That didn't change what he'd done, but it added something to my understanding of it. I thanked Frank and drove back north in the dark. The road ran through timber and open pasture, the way it always did, the same way it would tomorrow. The headlights picked out the lane markings and the tree line, and nothing else. I thought about two women who had both known for years exactly what they were doing. One had spent those years building something and making sure it would hold. The other had spent them working out how to take it apart. The difference between them was not a small thing. It was everything. I spent 4 days preparing, not rehearsing what I would say, understanding what I was walking into. I spread the Pinnacle Group materials across the kitchen table, every page Frank had given me, plus the county assessment documents from the bank and the land ledger entries I had transcribed from Eleanor's notebook into a plain spiral pad. I worked through it the way I'd watched Eleanor work through things that mattered slowly, with a pencil making notes in the margins. The project, as Pinnacle had designed it, was substantial. A destination resort on the eastern shore of Harlow Lake. Luxury accommodations. A private marina, a golf course running along the southern Ridge Lakefront villa, units staggered up the hillside. Total projected investment, $180 million. Projected completed value, $480 million. The kind of numbers that don't belong in a county with 4 blocks of Main Street and a post office that looked like it was built in the 1880s. I spent a full afternoon on the site maps. The resort required lake frontage on 3 sides. It required road access through the eastern corridor. It required the northern ridge for the golf course elevation and the visual buffer from county roads. Pinnacle had designed the project around land that was in every meaningful sense mine. Without the eastern shore parcels, no marina, no villa access. Without the northern ridge, no golf course, no elevation design. Without the access corridor running east from the county road, no construction access, no utility right-of-way, no viable ingress for guests. They needed all of it. They had designed the whole project assuming they would eventually get it. Eleanor had known that too. She had written Declined in 2008 when someone else had come asking, and she had continued acquiring parcels for another 6 years after that. On the 3rd evening, I stood in the doorway of the study and looked at the map on the wall. I had looked at it a dozen times since I'd put it up, but always as a record, a proof of what Eleanor had done. This time, I looked at it differently. 310 acres, 7 parcels, 41 years in terms of what she'd held the longest. Every boundary she had drawn ran along a line that mattered. The eastern shore, the northern ridge, the access corridor. She had not bought land randomly or opportunistically. She had bought the land that would be necessary, the pieces without which a development of this scale could not exist. She had understood what this land was before anyone else did. I thought about something she had said once, not written in the notebook, but said years ago, sitting at the kitchen table in the house we'd shared for 19 years. I couldn't remember the exact context. Something about a neighbor dispute over a fence line. Land is power, she had said, but the power isn't in selling it. It's in deciding who gets to use it and for how long. I had agreed at the time, and then forgotten it, the way you forget things that don't yet apply to you. Standing in the doorway of her study, looking at 38 years of careful decisions on the wall, I understood what she had been telling me. I settled on the terms in my mind sometime during the 4th evening. Not a sale, 60 years leased. Annual payment plus a percentage of gross revenue. Frank would handle the exact figures, but the structure was clear to me. The land would come back, or it would come back to whoever came after me, which was the same principle. And one clause that was not open to discussion. Ellie's Grove. 50 acres on the northern hillside, the slope above the lake where Eleanor had set up her easel on clear mornings, where she'd made the sketches that became the paintings on the cabin walls, where the maple canopy ran dense and unbroken from the ridge down to the water's edge. No construction, no clearing, no development of any kind in perpetuity. I wrote it out in plain language on a sheet of paper and set it on top of the Pinnacle file. If they wanted the land, they agreed to that. There was no version of this where they didn't. The morning of the meeting, I got up early. I made coffee. I ate. I looked at the lake from the kitchen window for a few minutes, the water flat and gray-blue in the early light, the far tree line still. The kind of morning that asks nothing of you and gives nothing back, which was exactly what I needed. I went upstairs and opened the small travel bag I'd been living out of since October. The gray flannel shirt was at the bottom, folded the way I'd packed it the way Eleanor had taught me to pack shirts so the collar didn't crease. She had given it to me for my 58th birthday. A dark charcoal flannel good fabric, the kind of thing she said I should have more of and never bought enough of for myself. It was the only decent thing I had brought. I put it on, checked the collar in the bathroom mirror, and went downstairs. Frank called as I was backing down the drive. Victor Hale just confirmed, he said. He's bringing William Cross. A pause. James William Cross doesn't attend meetings unless the deal is real. He doesn't leave the city for anything preliminary. I turned onto the state road and pointed the truck south. Good, I said. Then he'll hear everything. Frank's office was on the second floor above the hardware store on Main Street. I arrived 20 minutes early and took the chair nearest the window. The room was what I'd expected, 2 rectangular tables pushed together, 6 chairs, a whiteboard on one wall, with something erased but not quite gone, a window that looked down onto the street below. The kind of room where things get decided, without looking like the kind of room where things get decided. Frank brought coffee and set it on the table without ceremony. They'll be here at 10, he said. I sat with the window at my back and waited. Victor Hale arrived exactly on time. He was in his mid-40s, the kind of mid-40s that comes with a good tailor and a consistent gym schedule. Dark suit, no tie, the particular confidence of someone who has been in a lot of rooms like this one and has usually left them having gotten what he came for. He shook my hand firmly and took the chair across the table, set a leather portfolio in front of him, and arranged himself the way people do when they want to appear relaxed. William Cross came in behind him. He was older, mid to late 60s, silver-haired, compact. His suit was the kind you don't notice the brand of because the cut does all the work. He didn't say much when he came in. He looked at the room first, a single pass, unhurried the way someone reads a page before deciding whether to read it again. Then he looked at me. Then he sat down. Frank made the introductions. Brief, professional. William Cross nodded once at his name and opened a slim folder he had brought with him, the way a person opens something they intend to reference rather than read. Victor presented the offer at 10 past 10. He walked through it efficiently, the way someone does when they've given the same presentation enough times to have removed every unnecessary word. $132,000 per acre for all 7 parcels totaling approximately $13.2 million. Full acquisition, 30-day close, no contingencies. Clean title transfer. He slid a bound summary across the table. I read it, not quickly page by page the way Frank had taught me to read documents that mattered. The language was standard. The numbers were what he'd said. I set it face down on the table. I'm not selling, I said. The room went quiet. Victor's expression didn't change, but something behind it did a small recalibration. The adjustment of a man who had not expected that sentence. We have flexibility on the figure, he said. If the valuation is the concern, it isn't. I kept my voice even. The land isn't for sale, not 1 acre, not at any number. A pause. Then why are we here? Victor said. I reached into the folder Frank had set beside me and placed a single document on the table. 8 pages double-spaced, clipped at the corner. The lease proposal I had written out by hand over 4 evenings and Frank had put into proper form. Because I have a different proposal, I said. William Cross reached across and picked it up before Victor did. He read it the way he'd read the room when he walked in methodically without rushing, giving each section the time it needed. Victor waited. Frank watched. I sat still. When William Cross reached the 4th page, he stopped. He looked up at me, not the way he'd looked at me during the introductions, but differently. The way a person looks at someone when they've just understood something they hadn't known to look for. "Your wife painted here," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd read the Ellie's Grove clause, the 50 acres on the northern hillside, protected in perpetuity, no construction, no clearing, no development of any kind. And he had connected it to something. I didn't know what he knew about Eleanor or the land, and it didn't matter. The words were right. "For 30 years, I said. "The last good autumn she had before she got sick, she painted the maple forest above the lake. It's the largest canvas in the cabin." William Cross looked back down at the page. "The Grove stays," he said. Not a question either. A statement the kind that settles something. A different kind of quiet came into the room. Not the quiet of a stalled negotiation, but the quiet of a room where something has shifted. Victor opened his mouth and then didn't say anything. The door opened. I had not heard anyone on the stairs. The handle turned and the door swung inward, and Derek stepped into the room. He was dressed more carefully than he'd been at the cabin, a dark jacket pressed shirt, the version of himself he presented when he wanted to be taken seriously. He scanned the room in a single pass, Victor William Cross Frank, and then me. His expression was controlled, but the effort of controlling it was visible to anyone who knew what to look for. He was carrying a folder. It was new, the kind of folder you put together quickly, the binding still stiff, the edges sharp. Whatever was in it had not been there this morning. Whatever it contained, no one in this room had seen it. He stepped fully inside and let the door close behind him. Victor Hale shifted slightly in his chair, one hand resting near the edge of the table where his phone lay screen down. He moved into the room, as if he had every right to be there. The folder sat in his hand waiting. "And still here? Drop a comment with either father or son, so I know you're invested in this journey. Quick note. Before we continue the upcoming scenes, weave fictional scenarios for emotional depth. If you'd rather not engage with that, this is a natural stopping point." He stepped into the room as if he had every right to be there. Maybe for a last few seconds he believed that he did. "Derek Whitfield," he said, addressing the room. "Associate Director, Cornerstone Capital Partners." William Cross looked up, not with surprise, just the particular attention of someone who has registered information they will revisit later. Derek set the folder on the table and opened it, not rushed but not slow either. The movements of someone who had planned this moment and intended to control it. "The Harlow Land Trust," he said, "is currently under review for environmental compliance violations stemming from unauthorized timber operations conducted over a span of several years on parcels held within the trust." He pulled a clipped document from the folder and placed it in the center of the table. If referred to county review, the trust could be frozen indefinitely pending remediation findings. He looked at William Cross. "You would be signing a lease with a legally compromised asset," he said. Frank did not react immediately. He opened the brown expandable file he had brought and laid flat on the corner of the table the contingency file, the same one I'd seen him pull from the cabinet weeks ago. He worked through it methodically, section by section, until he found what he was looking for. A slim plastic sleeve containing photocopies of permits, each one dated, each one stamped by the county forestry office. Frank slid them across the table to William Cross without comment. "Every timber harvest conducted on trust land since 2003, Frank said. "Permitted, filed, documented, and archived. Every one." He looked at Derek. "Your document cites violations. The permits say otherwise." A pause. "One of these records is incorrect." I looked at Derek. She anticipated this too, I said. Derek's hand resting on the folder went still. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the small black recorder. I set it on the table. I didn't explain what it was. I didn't need to. I pressed play. The voice that came out of the small speaker was Derek's. "Not recorded yesterday or last week. Recorded on June 14th, over 2 years ago, in a room I had not been in, but could picture clearly now, the kitchen table in the house Eleanor and I had shared for 19 years. The house Derek had grown up in." His voice was clear. There was no static, no distortion, just his words preserved exactly as he had said them. He never earned any of it. The house, the accounts, everything that was you, not him. And when you're gone, I'm taking what's mine. A pause. He won't fight it. You know he won't. And even if he tries, he doesn't have anything to fight with. Then silence. Not the silence of an ended recording, but the silence of another person in the room, a person who had listened and chosen not to speak. Eleanor's silence held across 4 minutes and 17 seconds until the recording stopped. The room was utterly still. William Cross set his pen down. Victor Hale looked away, not at anything in particular, just away. Frank reached across and turned the recorder off. The click was louder than it should have been. Derek stood at the end of the table. His face had not changed, but something behind it had. The calculation, the preparation, the control he had carried into the room, all of it had come apart. Frank turned back to the Pinnacle file, the internal records I had seen in his office the week before. He flipped to the last page and turned it so it faced William Cross. He pointed to a single name in the contact log. Carol Merritt, Regional Land Consultant. Initial contact, March 2017. 7 years ago, Frank said. Before Eleanor passed, before any of the legal proceedings began. He paused. Your initial contact on the Harlow Lake project came from Derek Whitfield's mother. Victor Hale went pale. William Cross leaned forward slightly and read the line. Then he sat back. He looked at Derek, not with anger, not with anything sharp or loud. Just a single, almost imperceptible shake of his head, the gesture of a man who has seen enough and does not need to see more. Leave Derek, I said. 2 words, nothing extra. Derek stood motionless for 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked to the door. His hand went to the handle. The door opened. He stepped through. It closed behind him with a soft final click. I looked at William Cross. Where were we? I said. William Cross looked up at me. A brief smile crossed his face, not amusement exactly, but something closer to recognition. The look of a man who had just met someone he hadn't expected to meet in a room like this one. You're Lisi, he said. He pulled the document back toward him and picked up his pen. I left the building 10 minutes later. The meeting had continued terms, discussed figures, adjusted timelines, proposed. But my part in it had been done. Frank would handle the rest. He was better at it than I was, and I trusted him to know what mattered. At the bottom of the staircase, I stopped. My hands were shaking, not from fear, from something closer to the first full breath after being held underwater for a very long time. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A notification. A news alert, the kind that shows up when something nearby has been flagged by enough people that the algorithm decides you should see it. I opened it. A 47-second video clip. Posted 6 minutes ago, already 40,000 views. Someone in that room had recorded it. By the time I reached Ray's truck, the clip had 40,000 views. I sat behind the wheel with the engine off and watched the number climb on the screen. 43,000, 46, 52,000. The counter refreshed every few seconds, each refresh adding hundreds more. The video was 47 seconds long. Recorded from somewhere near the door of Frank's office, the angle suggested someone standing just inside the threshold, phone held at chest height. Lens pointed directly at the center of the conference table. The framing was steady, deliberate. Whoever had filmed it had known what they were capturing. The audio was clear. Derek's voice, preserved in the small black recorder Frank had placed on the table, came through with unmistakable clarity. He never earned any of it. The house, the accounts, everything that was you, not him. The caption beneath the video read, Family Trust Battle Erupts in New Hampshire. Boardroom audio recording reveals son's plan to seize inheritance from father. The first comment, posted 4 minutes after the video went live, had over 2,000 likes. This is the most brutal thing I've seen all year. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove north. Frank called before I reached the county line. It was Victor Hale, he said. No greeting, no preamble, just the fact. Security footage shows he placed his phone face down on the table when Derek started talking, recording angle toward the center. No one noticed until after the meeting ended. He sent it to a journalist. He knows someone who covers real estate litigation and high-value family disputes in the Northeast. He thought the public pressure would force you into a quick sale instead of holding out for the lease terms. He thought wrong, I said. He did. William Cross terminated his involvement in the project before you left the building. Hale's out, completely. James, this is going to move fast now. The video's already on 3 regional news platforms. It'll be picked up nationally by tonight. Are you prepared for that? No, I said, but it's happening anyway. I ended the call and kept driving. By late afternoon, there were reporters outside. 3 vehicles parked along the gravel track just past the gate. 2 people standing near the fence line with cameras the kind with long lenses and tripods. A third person, a woman in a dark coat, was walking the northern property line, as if checking sight angles for a better shot. I pulled into the drive slowly. They saw me immediately. One of them, a man in his 30s, press credentials hanging from a lanyard, started toward the porch before I'd even shut off the engine. I went inside, locked the door, and turned off every light in the house. Then, I sat at the kitchen table in the dark. The knock came 2 minutes later, firm, insistent, the kind of knock that expected an answer. Mr. Whitfield. A woman's voice, projected but polite. Sarah Kellerman, Northeast Regional News. I'd like to ask you a few questions about the Harlow Land Trust and the recording that was released this morning. I didn't move. Another knock. Mr. Whitfield, we're prepared to tell your side of this. A lot of people are watching. This is your chance to shape the narrative. I stayed at the table. After 20 minutes, the knocking stopped. Through the window, I could see them return to their vehicles. But they didn't leave. They stayed parked on the track engines, running, waiting. Frank called again just after 6. Derek Whitfield was terminated from Cornerstone Capital Partners this afternoon, effective immediately. The environmental compliance documents he submitted in the meeting have been referred to the state attorney's office for criminal fraud investigation. Good, I said. There's more. The story isn't just about Derek anymore. Eleanor's name is in every headline now. The Harlow Land Trust is being analyzed in detail on financial blogs, legal forums, local news sites. People are calling it the most sophisticated long-term asset protection strategy they've ever seen. They're calling it a revenge story. They're calling her a genius. I looked at the dark window. Beyond it, the silhouettes of the reporters' vehicles were still visible against the last gray light of the day. I didn't want her turned into a headline, I said quietly. Frank was silent for a moment. I know, but James, she's not just a headline. Not to the people who knew her. Not to Maggie, not to me, and not to you. William Cross called at 7:30. Mr. Whitfield, this is William Cross. His voice carried the same measured deliberateness it had in the meeting. I wanted to reach out personally. Pinnacle Group had no knowledge of or involvement in the recording or its release. Victor Hale acted independently and in direct violation of company policy. He has been removed from this project and will have no further involvement in any capacity. I didn't say anything. The lease offer stands, exactly as we discussed this morning. You have my word on that. Your word, I said. My word. I don't know if that carries any weight with you after what happened today, but it carries weight with me, and I intend to honor it. I looked out the window. One of the reporters was leaning against the hood of a sedan phone, pressed to their ear, gesturing as they spoke. It does, I said. Maggie came by just after 9. I heard her truck on the gravel before I saw the headlights. She parked near the porch and came up the steps without knocking. She found me still sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. Coffee, she said. I'm all right. She made a pot anyway, pulled 2 mugs down from the shelf, poured set one in front of me, and took the chair across the table. For a long time, she didn't say anything. Finally, she said, Eleanor would have hated this part. The cameras, the headlines. She always said, the best work is the kind no one sees until it's already done. She was right, I said. She usually was. We stayed like that for another hour. Maggie didn't leave until the last of the reporter's headlights had turned off the track and disappeared into the tree line. By midnight, the gravel drive was empty. I walked out to the porch and sat in one of the rocking chairs. Eleanor and I had dragged up from a yard sale in Millhaven years ago. The air was cold, the kind that settles in during mid-November when the season has finally made up its mind. The lake was invisible in the dark, but I could hear it faintly, the particular sound of still water shifting under its own weight. I pulled out my phone. 212 missed calls, 37 voicemails, messages I couldn't begin to count, and one text message from a number I hadn't heard from in 8 months, a number I recognized the moment I saw it. My son, 4 words. I need to talk. The reporters were gone by the next morning. I made coffee. I looked at the text message on my phone, still there, still waiting 4 words that hadn't changed since I'd read them the night before. I didn't answer right away. Not out of spite. Not because I was putting together what I wanted to say. I didn't answer because I had spent 8 months learning how to live without hearing from him, and another 3 weeks learning that the person I thought I knew had been someone else for longer than I'd understood. Whatever Derek needed to say could wait until I was ready to hear it. I poured a second cup of coffee, then a third. I sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the lake. The water was flat and gray in the morning light, the far tree line bare and skeletal against the pale sky. November had settled in completely now. The cabin was cold in the mornings, but I'd learned to manage it. Smaller fires in the wood stove, an extra layer of clothing, the particular rhythm of a place that asked you to meet it where it was. The phone sat on the table in front of me. The screen stayed dark. 8 months of silence and now 4 words. I need to talk. Not, I'm sorry. Not can we talk. Just a statement of need as if need alone were reason enough. He called at 10:15. Not a text this time. A call. I let it ring twice. Then I picked up. Derek. A pause on his end longer than I expected. Then, Dad. His voice was different. Not the voice from the porch weeks ago. Not the voice from the meeting room. The calculation was gone. What was left sounded flatter, more worn down. They fired me, he said. Cornerstone Capital, this morning, effective immediately. And they've referred the environmental compliance documents to the state attorney's office for criminal fraud investigation. I didn't say anything. He kept going. The will, the amended will. That was Carol's plan. She had a lawyer draft it. She told me it was a standard estate procedure, that it would protect the property from being contested down the line. I agreed to sign it. You agreed to forge your mother's signature, I said. It wasn't a question. A long silence on the other end of the line. Yes, he said. There was a pause. Derek's voice came back quieter, more brittle. When the video went public, she stopped answering my calls. Her lawyer sent a letter 2 days ago. She's claiming she had no knowledge of the forged signature, that I acted independently. I set my coffee cup down carefully on the table. My hand was steady. That surprised me. I had expected anger, the kind that makes your hands shake and your voice rise. But what I felt instead was something colder and more distant. A kind of clarity that comes from finally hearing the thing you already knew said out loud by the person who did it. I thought about Eleanor in the hospital room, the IV line, the pale yellow walls, the sound of the monitor that beeped every few seconds, steady and mechanical. I had been there every day. I had slept in a chair that didn't recline. I had read to her when she couldn't sleep and held her hand when the pain made it hard to breathe. And during that same week, Derek had been here walking the property line with a man I didn't know, carrying maps, measuring distances, calculating. Did you go to the land the week your mother was in the hospital? I asked. Another pause, longer this time. Yes. Did you visit her? The silence stretched. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, shallow breaths uneven. I could hear him deciding whether to lie. I could hear the exact moment he decided not to. No, he said. The word landed in the kitchen and stayed there. I looked at the window. A bird landed briefly on the porch railing, tilted its head, and flew off. I set the phone face down on the table. I didn't end the call. I just set it down speaker side against the wood and sat back in the chair. From beneath it, very faint, I could hear Derek's voice. Dad. I picked the phone back up. I'll call you when I'm ready, I said. Don't contact me before then. I ended the call. I sat at the table for a long time after that, not thinking about what to do next, not planning a response or working through my feelings about it, just sitting with the silence, letting it settle the way water settles after something heavy has passed through it. After a while, I got up and walked down the hall to Eleanor's study. The room was exactly as it had been since the day I'd put the hand-drawn map up on the wall. The late morning light came in at an angle, pale and cold. I opened the bottom drawer of the desk. The sealed envelope was where I had put it weeks ago after Frank had given it to me at the bank. It had been in the safe deposit box, along with everything else. My name wasn't on this one. Derek's was, written in Eleanor's handwriting across the front of a plain white envelope, sealed with clear packing tape along the flap, the tape slightly yellowed at the edges from age. I lifted it out carefully and set it on the desk in front of me. I stood there for a long time just looking at it. Derek's name, in her hand, written carefully the way she wrote things that mattered. I didn't know when she had sealed this envelope, or what she might have written inside. I didn't open it, not yet. I left the envelope on the desk and went back to the kitchen. I washed the coffee cups. I wiped down the counter. I did the small tasks that don't require decisions. Frank called in the early afternoon. "There's something I need to show you," he said. No greeting, just straight into it. I've been going back through the materials Eleanor left in the safe deposit box. There was one document I didn't give you. At the time, I wasn't certain it was relevant to the immediate legal situation. After what happened in that meeting and after the video, I think you need to see it. "What is it?" I said. "It's better if you see it in person. Can you come to the office tomorrow morning? Det är seorst, ready from the life for us." I looked at the window. The light outside had started to change. I thought about the envelope on Eleanor's desk. I thought about the map on the wall. I thought about 310 acres drawn in her careful hand, every parcel labeled and dated, every boundary marked as if she'd known exactly what she was building and why. "I'll be there," I said. Frank called the next morning before I had finished my coffee. "Come in," he said. "There's something you need to see." I drove to Millhaven under a sky the color of old cement. The kind of sky that sits low and doesn't move, doesn't change, just holds its position and makes everything underneath it feel smaller and flatter than it is. Frank was waiting at the door when I arrived. He didn't say anything, just gestured me up the stairs and into the same conference room where everything had happened 3 days ago. The room looked different in daylight, smaller, quieter, the kind of space that holds on to what happened in it, whether you want it to or not. He had a single document laid out on the table, not a file, not a packet, just one document, maybe 4 pages clipped at the corner with a silver binder clip. "Yes, sit down," Frank said. I sat. He turned the document so it faced me and slid it across the table. "This is Eleanor's second will," he said, "separate from the Harlow Land Trust, dated April 2022, years before she passed." I looked at the top page. The language was formal, dense in the way legal documents are when they're written to be enforceable rather than readable. But the essentials were clear enough once I slowed down and read them carefully. Eleanor's estate, as defined under this, will consist of the cabin property, the 11 paintings on the walls, the personal effects contained therein, and a small savings account that had been held in her name alone. The land was not part of this will. The land had already been transferred to the Harlow Land Trust years earlier, and the trust had its own governing documents. This will was about everything else. I turned the page. The beneficiary was named on the second page. Derek Whitfield. Not me, not both of us, just Derek. Eleanor had left the cabin to him. I sat with that for a moment. It wasn't shock exactly, more like the slow rearrangement of something I thought I'd understood, but had been looking at from the wrong angle. I turned to the third page. There was a clause at the bottom, a single paragraph set apart from the rest of the document by extra spacing above and below it. The kind of formatting that tells you someone wanted this part to be seen, to be read carefully, to be understood without ambiguity. It read, "This bequest shall be rendered void in its entirety if the named beneficiary initiates any legal proceedings against James Arthur Whitfield, or attempts to contest challenge, or circumvent the Harlow Land Trust in any form at any time for any reason." I read it twice. Then I looked up at Frank. "By filing the forged will," Frank said quietly, "and by initiating the restraining order petition, Derek triggered the voiding clause." A pause. "He forfeited the cabin the moment he filed the motion." I looked back at the document. Eleanor had known. She had known what Derek would do, not specifically maybe, but generally. She had known he would come after the land. She had known he wouldn't wait. She had known he would push and scheme and try to take what he thought was his, by force or by manipulation, or by whatever means he could assemble. and she had closed that door before he ever reached it. "Does he know this exists?" I asked. "No," Frank said. "Only you and I know. Eleanor instructed me not to disclose it unless you asked, or unless it became legally necessary." He paused. "It's not legally necessary. The trust is secure. The cabin title is still in Eleanor's estate, but with the voiding clause triggered, it would revert to you under the default provisions. So Derek has no legal claim to any of it." "None." Frank looked down at the document briefly. "There's one more thing you should know. Carol Merritt is also under investigation. Pinnacle Group provided records showing she initiated contact under false representation. She's retained separate counsel." I looked at the will again. My son's name written in the formal language of estate planning, a gift that had been prepared, notarized, filed, and then destroyed by the very person it had been meant for. I sat there for a long time. Frank didn't rush me. He just sat across the table, hands folded, waiting. The question came to me slowly, the way questions do, when you're not sure you want to know the answer. Should I tell Derek? If I told him, he would understand, maybe for the first time, that his actions hadn't just failed. They had cost him the one thing Eleanor had actually wanted to give him. Not the land, not the trust, the cabin, the place where he'd grown up, the place she'd kept and maintained and protected, and had set aside specifically for him. And he had lost it because he couldn't wait, because he'd chosen to fight instead of trust. That was the heaviest consequence. Not the criminal fraud investigation, not the public humiliation, not even being fired from Cornerstone Capital. The heaviest consequence was knowing that his mother had tried to give him something, and he had thrown it away before he even knew it existed. If I told him, he would carry that for the rest of his life. But if I didn't tell him, if I kept it to myself, buried the will in a drawer somewhere, and let him believe the only thing Eleanor had left behind was the land trust that excluded him, was that mercy? Or was it just another form of avoidance? A way of protecting him from a truth he had earned the hard way? I didn't know. I folded the will carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of my jacket, the same pocket where I'd been carrying the sealed envelope with Derek's name on it, the one Eleanor had left in the safe deposit box, the one I still hadn't opened. Two things she had left for him. One I could see. One I couldn't. I stood up. "Thank you, Frank," I said. He nodded. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," I said. "I need to think." I drove back to the cabin, slowly, the will and the envelope both resting in my jacket pocket, and tried to decide what kind of father I wanted to be in the days that came next. I signed the lease on a Friday morning. No ceremony, no champagne. Just my name repeated across 8 pages on documents that Eleanor had spent 38 years making possible. The lease terms were what Frank and I had negotiated over the past week, refined through 3 rounds of revisions with William Cross's legal team, and reviewed by an independent attorney Frank had brought in to make sure I understood what I was agreeing to. $920,000 per year, plus 3.1% of the resort's gross annual revenue once operations began. 60-year term renewable at my discretion, or the discretion of whoever came after me. Ellie's Grove, 50 acres on the northern hillside, preserved in perpetuity. No construction, no clearing, no development of any kind. Written into the lease as a non-negotiable condition that would void the entire agreement if violated. I signed the final page and set the pen down. William Cross reached across the table and shook my hand. His grip was firm, brief, professional. "If you're ever interested in investing elsewhere," he said, "come find me. I think you understand land better than most people I work with." "My wife taught me to invest in land," I said. "I'll stick to what she knew." He nodded once. Smart man. I drove back to the cabin in the early afternoon. The sky had cleared for the first time in days. Not blue exactly, but a pale gray-white that let the light through without warmth. The kind of sky that belongs to late November, when winter is coming, but hasn't quite arrived yet, and everything is waiting. I pulled Eleanor's easel out onto the porch one last time. I set up the canvas I'd been working on for the past 2 weeks, the one with the lake and the tree line and the oversized, broccoli-shaped maples that looked more like a child's drawing than anything resembling serious landscape work. I mixed the oils the way I'd been teaching myself to mix them more by trial and error than by any real understanding of color theory, and I painted the lake in the afternoon light. It was still bad. The proportions were off. The reflection in the water didn't match the angle of the trees. The colors were close, but not quite right, like something remembered from a distance rather than observed up close. It didn't matter. When I finished, I signed it in the bottom right corner, the way Eleanor used to sign hers, 2 letters small and deliberate. JW. I brought it inside and hung it on the wall next to Eleanor's 11 paintings. The 12th painting. The worst one of the 12 by a long measure, and somehow exactly where it belonged. I called Ray that evening, and just wanted to say thank you, I said. For the couch, for the truck, for not asking too many questions. Ray was quiet for a moment. Then, "You doing all right up there?" "I think so," I said. "Yeah, I think I am." "Good," he said. "That's good, James." We ended the call. That night I sat at Eleanor's desk in the study. The 2 things she had left for Derek were in front of me, the sealed envelope with his name written in her handwriting, and the copy of the real will that Frank had made for me before I left his office that morning. I had spent the past 2 days thinking about whether to give Derek both or just one or neither. The envelope that was Eleanor's intention. Whatever she had written inside it, she had meant for him to have it. That part was clear. The will was harder. If I gave it to him, he would know. He would understand maybe for the first time that his mother had tried to give him something real. Not the land, not the trust, but the cabin. The place where he'd grown up, and that his own actions had taken it away before he'd ever known it existed. That knowledge would be heavy, the kind of weight that doesn't go away. But Eleanor had forgiven him. I knew that now. Not because she'd said it out loud, but because she'd left him the envelope. Because she'd written his name on it in her careful hand and sealed it and kept it safe for years, waiting for the right moment. That forgiveness deserved to be delivered whole, not softened, not edited, not made easier by withholding the truth of what it had cost. I made one phone call before I made my decision final. "Frank," I said when he picked up, "I need you to do something for me." "Go ahead." "Keep a certified copy of Eleanor's 2020 will in your office safe, not filed, just kept, in case Derek ever questions its authenticity." A pause. "You're going to give it to him." "I am." Another pause. Longer this time. "All right, I'll have it locked in the safe tonight." "One more thing," I said. "Note the time of my visit to the cabin tonight, in your records, just in case." Frank was silent for a moment, then quietly, "You think he might—" "I don't know what he'll do," I said, "but I want there to be a record." "Understood," Frank said. "I'll make the notation." I ended the call and looked at the 2 documents on the desk. The envelope Eleanor had sealed, the will Eleanor had written, both of them acts of love in their own way, one offering forgiveness, one offering truth. I put them both in a plain brown folder and set the folder on the corner of the desk where I could see it. Then I picked up my phone and called my son. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Dad, come to the cabin," I said. "Tonight, it's time." That evening, after Ray's truck had been returned to the driveway and the paintings had been hung on the wall, I made the call. He answered on the 1st ring. "I'm coming," he said. Derek arrived just after dark. I heard the engine before I saw the headlights. The silver pickup coming up the gravel track slowly, as if he wasn't sure whether he should be there or whether he'd be turned away at the gate. He parked near the porch and got out. No blazer this time, no calculated posture. Just a man in his mid-30s wearing a jacket that didn't quite fit the weather and carrying the particular heaviness of someone who had run out of moves and knew it. I was standing on the porch when he reached the steps. I didn't invite him inside. We stayed where we were on Eleanor's porch under the roof she'd designed, looking out at the lake she'd painted 100 times in 100 different lights. I held out the sealed envelope first. He looked at it for a long moment before taking it. His eyes went to the handwriting on the front, his name written in Eleanor's careful script, and his hands, when he reached for it, were shaking. He didn't say anything. He just held it, turning it over once as if checking to make sure it was real. Then he opened it. I turned and looked at the lake while he read. It wasn't my letter, it was Eleanor's. Whatever she had written to him, she had written for him, and I had no need to know what it said. The sound that came from behind me wasn't words. It was the sound of someone crying after holding it in for a very long time. Quiet at first, then less so. The kind of grief that doesn't ask permission and doesn't care who's listening. I stayed where I was and waited. After a while, the sound stopped. I heard him fold the letter and put it back in the envelope. I heard him take a breath, long, uneven, the kind you take when you're trying to reassemble yourself after something has knocked you flat. I turned back and handed him the second document. "This is your mother's real will," I said. "Dated April 2020, 2 years before she passed." He looked at me, then at the document. "Read it," I said. He read slowly. I watched his face as he worked through the formal language, the legal phrasing, the clause at the bottom that explained what he'd forfeited and why. When he finished, he didn't say anything right away. He just stood there holding the will in one hand and the envelope in the other, looking at the cabin, then at the lake, then at me. "She knew," he said finally. "She knew I would do it." "Yes." "And she forgave me anyway." "That's who she was." He looked down at the will again. Then slowly he set the envelope on the porch railing and reached for the document with both hands, not to read it again, but to fold it, to put it away, maybe to take it with him. My hand was there first. Not aggressive, not fast. Just there resting on the edge of the paper, calm and steady before he could lift it. "That's a copy, Derek," I said. "The original is at Frank's office, in his safe, certified and notarized." He stopped. A long pause. He looked at my hand on the paper. Then he looked at me, really looked maybe for the first time since he'd arrived. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. He understood. Slowly he took his hand away and let the document rest on the railing where I'd placed it. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. "I know." He picked up the envelope, Eleanor's letter, and held it carefully as if it were the only thing left in the world that mattered. Then he walked down the porch steps, got into his truck, and drove back down the gravel track without looking back. I stood on the porch and watched the taillights disappear around the bend in the tree line. The sound of the engine faded. The gravel went quiet. I was alone. The night had settled in completely now. The kind of dark that belongs to places without streetlights, where the only sound is the lake shifting under its own weight and the wind moving through bare branches. I turned and looked through the window into the main room of the cabin. 12 paintings hung on the walls, lit by the single lamp I'd left on near the kitchen. 11 of them were Eleanor's careful, deliberate beautiful, in the way things are beautiful when they've been made by someone who understood what they were looking at. One of them was mine, rough and uneven and badly proportioned, signed in the corner with 2 letters that didn't carry any of the weight hers did, but somehow belonged there anyway. J.W. I thought about something Eleanor had said once, years ago, in a conversation I hadn't fully understood at the time. Patience isn't waiting. It's knowing what you're waiting for. I hadn't known back then what she meant. I'd thought she was talking about land or money or the slow accumulation of things that take years to build. But she hadn't been talking about any of that. She'd been talking about this. The porch, the lake, the quiet that comes when everything you've been carrying finally sets down. The certainty that someone you loved had thought of everything, not just the land, not just the trust, but the hardest parts too. The parts that required forgiveness and patience and the particular kind of love that plans for decades without ever asking for credit. I hadn't been waiting for justice. I hadn't been waiting for money. I hadn't been waiting for any of the things I thought I'd lost when Derek took me to court 8 months ago. I'd been waiting for this. The water lapped against the dock Eleanor had built with her own hands 30 years ago, back when the cabin was new to us and the lake was just a place we came on weekends before it became the place that held everything. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Looking back now, I realize family betrayal doesn't always come with warning signs. It comes dressed in familiar voices and questions asked gently over dinner tables, in the assumption that blood means loyalty. My son taught me that trust when misplaced costs more than money, it costs the years you can't get back. If you're facing a family story like mine, don't do what I did. Don't assume love is enough to protect what you've built. Don't wait until the courtroom to realize that some people see inheritance as a transaction, not a legacy. And don't carry the weight alone. Eleanor planned for decades in silence, but I wonder now if she ever wished she could have shared that burden. Here's what I learned. Forgiveness doesn't erase consequence. I gave Derek his mother's letter, and the truth about what he'd lost, not to punish him, but because he deserved to know the full weight of his choices. Family betrayal cuts deep, but pretending it didn't happen cuts deeper. This family story isn't about revenge. It's about patience, the kind Eleanor practiced for 38 years, the kind that knows what it's building even when no one else can see it. The Lord works in ways we don't always understand in the moment, and sometimes His mercy looks like a sealed envelope left behind by someone who loved you enough to plan for your worst day. If this family story resonates with you, I hope you'll share your perspective in the comments. What would you do if you found yourself in a situation like this? I genuinely value hearing your thoughts. If this narrative moved you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. A gentle note, while inspired by real-world dynamics around estate planning and family conflict, certain elements have been heightened for storytelling purposes. If this content doesn't suit your preferences, feel free to explore other videos that may resonate more.